We're back, still in chapter 1, of course. This will be section 2, the science of psychology. In this section, we will talk about the goals, hypotheses, and methods of conducting psychological research. So the goals are really best illustrated in this kind of diagram here. So the first thing we want to do is describe a behavior. Then we want to try to explain, well, why is that happening? The next thing we do is want to predict when it might happen again. And finally, control or change. And I know that kind of sounds a little shady, right? Oh, we're trying to control me or change my behavior, but that's not always the case, right? So sometimes we're doing things that they're not necessarily good behaviors that we want to correct or change. So let's say the first behavior we want to describe is that we've noticed kind of that there's been an increase in teenagers vaping. Right. And so this can be dangerous, it can be unhealthy, but it seems like a lot more are doing it. So the next thing we do is try to explain, well, what is this increase about? You know, what's going on? Why are people vaping more? Does it have to do with like their friend groups? Does it have to do with accessibility to vapes or how easy it is to get them? The next thing we want to do is like, okay, so once we figure out why, will we be able to predict like what teenagers or is there something about certain teenagers that will predict them more likely to become addicted to vaping? And then of course, to change that, can we either prevent it or help them stop? What are some behaviors? So in most cases, we're trying to manipulate behavior, but in a good way. Okay, so the purpose of the scientific method is to have a set of rules. So all the scientists are following along to test their hypothesis. The purpose of psychological research is to test ideas about behaviors. And researchers use the scientific method when they're testing about ideas and behaviors so that everyone can like follow the script and we can make sure that it's actually scientific and not just observational or pseudoscientific. So the first step is to observe a behavior. This begins with a causal or informal observation, kind of something you notice around you, like, oh, I notice a lot more teenagers are vaping these days. What's going on with that? You would then formulate a research question. Well, so I want to know what's behind this, right? I want to know why teenagers are vaping. And I have some ideas. Maybe it's peer pressure. Maybe it's access to vapes. So the next thing we're going to do is create a testable prediction. If this, then that. So if you could say, I kind of think maybe it's about peer pressure, about the influence of peers, because we know teenagers are often influenced by their peers significantly. So I want to know if a teen has more friends than not that are vaping, are they more likely to try it? So we could set up if a teenager has 50% of their friends or more who vape regularly, I believe that they are more likely to vape. So that's my question. I can test that. So then we create a survey, right? So we go around and we survey and we say, do you vape? If so, yes or no. How many of your friends are vaping? Approximately percentage. And then do you feel like this would influence you? And then we can kind of get that data back and we say, oh, yes, it does seem like there is something to do with the friend group. And then we can interpret that. Is it because of peer pressure? Is it because people whose are around vaping, there's some other cause going on, right? So we can go back to the drawing board and then refine our form and reformulate our research question so we can finally kind of answer, well, what is really going on and interpret these conclusions. Eventually, we want to kind of create a new theory about what's going on. And so we continually refine our question and add more data and collect more information and try to interpret what is actually going on in the situation. It's very important that you can replicate data. So if one survey says one thing, that's really not enough. If you can't get it to be reliable, right? It's like, okay, so maybe it was a one-off that study. So we have this thing called the replication crisis, which is where you can't reproduce the same result from your data. And that's problematic because, okay, that maybe was just a random thing. Sometimes the problem replication crisis arises because of the type of questions or the practices of the researcher. It could also be confirmational bias. So confirmational bias is when you only look for information that confirms whatever you believe. So one example of confirmation bias is like, okay, every time I'm driving to work and I'm late, I hit all the red lights. And it's ridiculous. Like, I don't know why this is happening to me. Every time I drive, I'm late and I hit every single red light. Well, probably not. You probably hit the same amount of red lights on average, but if you're running late, you notice the red lights more. So you take that information because it's actually impacting you. If you're early or you have plenty of time, you're sitting in a red light's not a big deal, so you don't really notice it, right? So that's an example of conformational bias, and we do this across the board in all of our life activities. But one of the things we do in science to try to avoid these kinds of things is we use very large samples, so big groups, not just tiny little groups where it's kind of a random one-off, or meta-analyses. So meta-analyses are basically kind of a big, huge study of all the studies that have been done on a topic. And they're very useful when kind of trying to figure out theoretical issues. All right. So there's two types of hypotheses, predictive and causal. Predictive is really just where you can see a relationship between two variables, and then causal is that one thing is causing another thing. So very straightforward. It's also important to use the proper sampling methods when conducting research. So you have a sample and you have the population. So the population is all the possible people of interest. So if we go back to our vaping question, all the possible teenagers in America, well, it's unlikely that we can like send a survey to every single teenager in America, right? So we want to take a sample. We try to do random sampling to ensure that it's not like a biased group. Our sampling isn't biased. So it really that the sample is representative of the population, so that when we do the study, we can now take the results and apply it to the population. We can say, well, this group of 100 teenagers is representative of the general population. So whatever we find out, we can generalize it or apply it to infer that that's how everybody's acting. Sometimes random sampling is impossible. Sometimes we use like a sample of convenience, because maybe you can't just randomly sample all the teenagers in America. Maybe you have to do a school. So just have to make sure, that's fine. It happens all the time, but just make sure when you're interpreting that data, you can say, well, your sample was a little bit, small, or only came from this region or something. So it's not necessarily generalizable. We have naturalistic observations and case studies. So this is Jane Goodall. She actually went out into the jungle and observed chimpanzee behavior to learn more. We can do that in the real world. Maybe you're interested in how children behave on the playground. A lot of times naturalistic observations can lead to research or experimental questions. We also have case studies. So that's where you look at one person very, very in depth. A lot of times there is something special about that person. Maybe they have a particular disorder or a particular deficit. And so you want to learn more about that. We'll see that in our chapter on memory with HM. So he had part of his hippocampus was removed, or I think maybe his whole hippocampus, part of his temporal lobe, and he lived. Yay. But he had these weird memory deficits. So a lot of people did a lot of studies on him to try to understand how memory works. These are great methods. The only true disadvantage or the greatest disadvantage is that they're not generalizable, because you're just kind of looking in nature at this one little group or looking at this one guy. And so you can't necessarily say that's how everyone would act or behave. Surveys are great. I'll get a lot of data really quick. We can look at the how and the why of things, and look at predictive hypotheses. Well, what kinds of things go together? However, people who take surveys are special because they're willing to take surveys. I don't know about you, but I'm not willing to take surveys. So we call that self-selecting bias. So people who are willing to participate in the survey, there might be something special about them. They might be people pleasers, or they might try, just participate a lot more than the average person. So you have to be careful when interpreting the data and look really critically at how the wording is presented on the sample or on the survey. Correlational studies, they show us a relationship. Correlation is not causation. That's very important. The strength of the correlation is measured from -1 to +1. So you can have negative correlation and a positive correlation. A negative correlation means that the variables change in opposite directions. So as one goes up, the other one goes down. And positive correlations change in the same direction. So they both go up together, or they both come down together, but it does not mean one is causing the other. There is just a relationship. So if we take a look, here's 3 examples of kind of some graphs. So on the left, you have the attraction and attitude. So if you're attracted, amount of attraction to someone, and if they have a similar attitude, this is an example of a positive correlation. So the more similar attitude, the more they think like you, the more you like that person, right? Because you think the way you think is better. You think your attitudes are right, correct. So this is a positive correlation. So that whole thing about opposites attract, not so much when you look at your beliefs and your attitude system. The middle one is a negative correlation. So as your level of depression goes up, your relationship satisfaction goes down, and vice versa. Again, not causing, but we see people who have a lot of relationship satisfaction tend to not be very depressed. Whereas people who are very low and really unhappy and miserable in their relationship are more likely to have some depressive symptoms. So that's a negative correlation. One goes up, the other one goes down. Finally, this last one, shoe size and amount of attractiveness. This is just a straight line across. They're not correlated. This would be a 0 correlation. There's no relationship between your shoe size and how much you're attracted to someone. Okay, so here we have an example. Just demonstrate it's not causation. So you have high academic achievement, you have high self-esteem. Well, maybe getting good grades makes you have, good self-esteem. Or maybe people with high self-esteem are more likely to try to get good grades. Or maybe they're related, but there's a whole third element that nobody is looking at. And this could be your genetics. There are some genetic components that increase intelligence and test-taking ability. They're also linked to increasing your self-esteem, right? So that's called a third variable problem. Another example, my favorite example of a third variable problem, is that there is a correlation between a positive correlation between number of churches and crime rate. So the more churches, the more crime. The more crime, the more churches. And you're like, wait a minute, what are church people like out there committing crimes? Are church people shady? Or are criminals? You need more churches because criminals are like needing to go to church to confess because they feel so bad for their crimes. What's going on there? Well, the situation is a third variable problem. So there are more churches and more crime correlated because of population size. So in very large cities, you have a higher crime rate, but you also have more churches. So one has nothing to do with causing the other. There's just a relationship there. Experiments. So experiments are used to test causality. So this causes this. In an experiment, you have one variable, the independent variable. And a lot of times this is described as the one that's manipulated. I don't like the way that's presented. It was always confusing to me, even in school. What do you mean? Who's manipulating it? What does that even mean? So it means the one that the experimenter is controlling. That's really what you're interested in. That's going to be the causing factor. Okay, the dependent variable is the thing we measure. That's the thing that is being impacted. So the independent variable is the cause. The dependent variable is measured as the effect. Okay, you want to make sure in an experiment you have 2 groups. You have your experimental group, which you're testing your little situation on, your hypothesis, and then your control group. So your control group is going to be exactly like your experimental group, except for the one thing that you're controlling. Okay, so let's say I invent a smart pill and I want to see if my smart pill helps people do better on math tests. So I have an experimental group and a control group. I randomly assign my people to be in one or the other. I can't just choose all the smart people to go in one. No, randomly assign. I give the experimental group my smart pill every day for a week. I give the control group a placebo. Okay, every day for a week. So everyone's getting a pill one day, take it in the morning, same time, everything's the same. Except one has my smart pill and one has just like a sugar pill, which is called a placebo. That's my independent variable. Okay, smart pill or no smart pill. The dependent variable, at the end of the week, I'm gonna give them a math test. And then I'm gonna look at performance on the math test. Did the people in the experimental group on average do better than the people in the control group? Right? Now, if I had given the pills at different times, that would not work. If I had given a different type of test, like, oh, I'll give a math test to the control group, but a reading test to the experimental group, we can't compare that. So everything else has to be the same except for the thing you're testing. Then we would see their scores. That would be my dependent variable, is their performance on this math test. And then we could compare to see if there was actually a difference. As I said, we'd use a placebo in my smart pill group because there is this thing called the placebo effect. So it turns out, as humans, if we take a pill, even if it has no medical use or it's nothing, it's just a sugar pill, we actually believe it makes us do better or get better, right? So that's called the placebo effect. So the placebo effect is where it's doing nothing, but because you think it's doing something, you actually perform better or feel better, okay? Weird, but it happens. That's why in drug trials, you always have to give a placebo to control for the placebo effect. Like, is the smart pill really making people smarter? Or is it just because they got a pill, they're performing better? In experiments, we also use double-blind studies. So double-blind study means that the participants don't know which group they're in, and the experimenters don't know who's in whose group. You usually do it coding. You're like, well, how do you go back and analyze the data? You give codes and you decipher it at the end. But if the person thinks they're in the smart pill group, they might actually do better on the test anyway. Just so you want to have double-blind, experimenter and participant don't know which group they're in. And then always control for those confounding variables. So that's anything that's different between the groups that's not your independent variable. Like I said, if they take the pill at a different time of the day, or if one group is taking the test and the AC goes out, like that would be confounding. So you want to eliminate those as much as possible. In order for the experiment to be appropriate, participants have to be randomly assigned. So you can't kind of say, okay, I'm going to give like a math pretest, and then all the people who do really well in it, put them in the smart pill group. No, you just have to randomly assign them. However, some experimental questions you can't randomly assign. So let's say you were interested in how children whose parents are divorced, so you're looking at third graders, so how they perform on third grade reading test, children with divorced parents versus children with married parents. Now, if I'm the experimenter, I can't just go around and seduce all the dads that are in the experimental group. Your parents are divorced or they're not. We can't control that. We can't randomly assign that. So that's called a quasi experiment. Because of the question itself, random assignment is impossible. So you have to just, it's still considered an experiment. It's still but it's called quasi. So experiments have a lot of advantages. They show us cause and effect. They can experiments explain and can change behavior. They do not describe behavior. So sometimes the descriptive part, we don't know why we're doing it, or sometimes they can't explain it. So it couldn't be an explanation. It could be something else. Experiments are generally conducted in labs. Sometimes people act different in a lab. Labs are very sterile. They don't necessarily mimic real world situations. So it might just be this thing that only happens in the lab and it doesn't happen in the real world. So it wouldn't be generalizable. We have reached the end of this lecture video. So for your written reflection 1.2, so the second one for chapter 1, please apply the steps of the scientific method to one of the following research questions. So pick one of these, A or B, and then create a research design. What design are you going to use? What kind of methods are you going to use? What's your independent variable? What's your dependent variable? So the first question is, does strength training, does working out result in improved cognitive performance? So how are you going to test cognitive performance? How are you going to determine how much they work out? What are you going to use for the control group? Okay. The other question is a plant-based diet associated with lower cholesterol? How are you going to determine? You're going to draw their blood. Who are you going to have people self-select into the plant-based diet? Are you going to force meat eaters to eat plants? So you got to think about all those things. Design an experiment that follows the scientific method and include that as your written reflection for one of these questions. That is it for this one, and I'll see you back for the next, or you'll see me back because I actually can't see you. Okay.